I am Joey Schneid from Evanston Township High School, Birmingham this round. Before we get started, there are a few people I'd like to thank. First and foremost, University of Illinois Springfield and the IHSA for hosting this tournament. I literally wouldn't be here without them. Second, I'd like to thank my parents for putting up with me being gone so many weekends of the year and just being really supportive in debate. I'd really like to thank the Evanston Township High School administration for being supportive of debate, really funding our team and making this possible. And then I'd like to give a huge thank you to the coaches at Evanston Township High School. I'd like to thank Charles Rudders, Eric Baker, Ali Woodhouse, and Jeff Hannon for just making me into the debater I am today. So, thanks. Now, if everyone is ready, judges, Owen? I affirm that placing political conditions on humanitarian aid is unjust. Carrie Manning, professor of political science at Georgia State University, defines conditional aid, writing, "The concept of conditionality refers to the promissory increase of aid in case of compliance by a recipient with conditions set by a donor or with withdrawal in the case of noncompliance. I value justice, defined as giving each their due. Justice is the best value for this debate because it has the strongest link to the resolution. The use of the word unjust means that the resolution is literally asking if political conditions on humanitarian aid are consistent with the principles of justice. My value criterion is respecting the autonomy of citizens. Justice requires that we recognize the capabilities that all people have as autonomous agents. All humans are due the right to make choices because the liberty to make choices is what defines us as human. Charles Freed writes, "Liberty is an expression of what is valuable about us as human beings. It is a moral imperative based on what is fundamental about our human nature. What makes us moral agents is our individual capacities to think, reason, choose, and value. Our individual responsibility for our lives and our choices. We are all equally valuable in the same way. It is from this base of our equal responsibility for ourselves that we choose our goods, that we choose what to make it the only life we will ever have. Citizens of a state make the autonomous choice to sacrifice some of their autonomy in the form of agreeing to follow the laws of the state. Because citizens give up freedoms to specific government in return for protection, governments must be accountable to their citizens. The social contract goes both ways. If a citizen breaks laws established by the government holds them accountable for breaching the social contract and punishes them. Likewise, the government must be accountable for fulfilling its promises to its citizens, which means that the citizens of a country must be able to have influence over the policies and laws enacted by their government." Contention 1. Donor countries can use conditional aid to coerce the governments of the countries that receive it. Poor countries need the aid that is provided by wealthy countries. As a result, they have to pander to wealthy donors and adopt the discourse of donor countries as well as conditions they may put on the aid. Francis Owasu writes, "In hope that it might win them aid, African leaders appear to have told the rich world everything it wants to hear. In order for the voices of African leaders to be heard in discussions about the future of the continent, they must learn to speak the language of hegemonic discourse. African leaders have been on the defensive, and international financial institutions have required countries to pursue minimal state policies. Years of experimentation with such policies have led many in the development community to search for new ways to discipline the African state. Conditions on U.S. food aid to Southern Africa in 2002 provide an example of this. U.S. and UN aid agencies wanted to send food aid containing genetically modified crops. The inclusion of genetically modified crops was not a necessary component of the food aid and was only included to promote U.S. interests. Noah Zerbe explains the motivations behind including GM crops in food aid, writing, "The inclusion of genetically modified maize in food aid shipments to Africa had nothing to do with ending hunger in the region. African food aid shipments were intended to promote the adoption of biotech crops in southern Africa, expanding market access and control of transnational corporations, and undermining smallholder production, thereby fostering greater food insecurity on the continent." Citing concerns with the safety of genetically modified crops, many African countries were hesitant to accept the aid. While the nations of Lesotho and Swaziland were eventually forced to comply, Zambia held out. Zerbe, too, explains the consequences of the Zambian holdout, writing, "Zambia, however, refused to accept any GM food aid until a team of Zambian scientists could study the potential health impacts of the maize. The Zambian panel concluded that the safety aspects of biotech food, including toxicity, allergenicity, and antibiotic resistance, were not conclusively resolved. Based on that report, the Zambian government rejected the inclusion of genetically modified maize in food aid shipments. The U.S. ambassador to the World Food Program, Tony Hall, argued that Zambia's decision to reject food aid was a crime against humanity. Countries in need of aid are coerced into accepting conditions on the aid because the alternative is to literally commit crimes against humanity. This turns aid into a tool that donors can use to force poor countries into adapting any conditions. By controlling the policies of poor countries, Western governments have more control over the country receiving aid than the citizens of that country does. In addition to coercing the governments of countries that receive aid, political conditions also undermine the worth of the citizens of a state by treating them as nothing more than a means that is used to control the government that's receiving aid. Robert Johnson writes, "We should never act in such a way that we treat humanity, whether in ourselves or in others, as a means only. This is often seen as introducing the idea of respect for persons, whatever for it is that is essential to our humanity. Intuitively, there seems to be something wrong with treating human beings as mere instruments with no all beyond us. By dehumanizing citizens, their capacity to act autonomously is diminished. Additionally, failing to recognize someone as a person means disrespecting their capability to act autonomously. Citizens of a state are used as leverage against the government when political conditions are placed on this. By threatening the lives of the citizens of a country to achieve its goals, the donor of the conditional aid is dehumanizing the citizens of the state receiving aid because it's asserting that its goals are more important than the lives of the citizens of this state. even if the recipient country has an oppressive government and the conditions are intended to alter the policies of the regime, the citizens of the country are still being dehumanized and exploited. Contention 2. States can become dependent on aid, which results in foreign donors having large amounts of influence. Countries that receive humanitarian aid for extended periods of time can become captured by the donors of aid. Because the government of the captured country is dependent on aid, they have little choice but to accept policies imposed by the donors, which in turn gives donors a tremendous amount of power over these countries. Deporting and broadening them further, is writing, continued over large periods of time, dependence on aid may make it more difficult for good governments and better institutions to develop. Large amounts of aid over long periods of time create incentives for governments and donors that have the potential to undermine good governance and the quality of state institutions. Aid may reduce local ownership, accountability, and democratic decision-making. In aid-dependent countries, donor agencies and foreign experts often take over many of the critical functions of government, substituting their own goals and using foreign experts and project management units in place of public institutions. By controlling parts of the governments, donors make the recipient government more accountable to them rather than to the citizens of the recipient government. This prevents the citizens of the country from being able to influence the policies and actions of their own government. This disrespects their autonomy because they no longer have the ability to ensure that the government fulfills its part of the social contract. Donor capture of states is a very real thing, and it's happening on a large scale in Africa right now. Many African countries are dependent on foreign aid, which in turn gives donors a tremendous amount of power. Ravi Kanbar explains, writing, governments of aid-dependent countries are not only more accountable to the donors than to their citizens, but in some cases the donors are actually controlling parts of the government. Africa suffers from aid dependence. African states' policymaking and implementation energies are devoted to interacting with external donor agencies rather than their own citizens. For these reasons, I urge an affirmative ballot in today's round. Okay, ready for cross?
Mm-hmm. All right, here we go. Okay, so is autonomy the only thing that makes up justice?
That is how I define justice. I say that being just means respecting the autonomy of people.
Okay.
And even though there are lots of things that account for justice, autonomy is the most important concern and should be looked to before anything else.
Why?
Because autonomy is what defines people as humans. Justice is concerned with giving people what they are due. And because autonomy is the most fundamental thing that defines the humanity of a person, they are due that above all else.
Okay, so if you don't have autonomy, then you're not. Then it's dehumanizing, and you're basically not a human.
Your humanity is being denied to you. You're not. If you don't have autonomy, it's ridiculous to say you're not a human. What's happening is that other people are taking your humanity away from you, and they are dehumanizing you.
Okay, and then also when we talk about these donor countries, in your contention one specifically, when you talk about these African countries and the maize here, was it the political condition of having these GMOs? Or was it the political condition from the recipient government saying that we don't want GMOs?
So the political condition was imposed by the donors, and what it said is that these countries had to change policies to allow genetically modified crops to be included in the aid. This would give Western corporations large amounts of power in these countries because they would have access to new markets. The countries obviously didn't want that because the GMO crops were really dangerous.
Did the U.S. and other people have a substantial amount of non-GMO food in order to give to them?
Yes.
Can I see the evidence that says they had enough to do that?
Yes. Zerbe 1 should say that, and he said what Zerbe 1 establishes, even if he doesn't explicitly say that there was an alternative, that there was enough aid.
Can I just
Can I give it to you after cross, or do you want to talk about it now?
Can you just put it up here?
Sure.
Thanks. And then
Let me just find the next page. Sorry.
All right.
All right, cool, got it.
Okay, cool. And then also when we're talking about the political influences here on your contention 2.
Yeah.
These governments that you talk about, where do you provide any examples of when this actually happens?
Okay, so this is happening on a massive scale in Africa right now. There are tons of countries that are being controlled by Western governments because these countries have become dependent on aid. What happens then is that the donor country exploits this dependency because the country that's dependent on aid has to accept conditions, which lets the donor country actually take over parts of the government.
What examples do you have of the negative harms of when they take away their autonomy?
Okay, so first, there's always going to be a harm because as long as the donor country is taking over parts of the recipient country, the autonomy of the citizens of the recipient countries can be hurt because the government is no longer counting them. But in addition to that, donor countries are using this to place their own policies and agendas in place of public institutions.
What's the difference between saying that the recipient's government is better than the donor's government?
That doesn't
why
matter.
are the policies better than one another?
That doesn't matter. What matters is that their donor country is forcing its policies on the recipient country, and it's denying the citizens of the recipient country any say in these policies.
Why is that
because
bad
it denies
if they're improving the government?
It denies their autonomy, and they're not improving the government. They're substituting their own goals in for ones that the recipient government has.
Can I see some examples of that?
This is, like I already said, this is happening on a massive scale.
Yeah, it's happening.
No, it is. Do you still want to see this?
Yeah. I'll just take running prep starting now. All right. I used 157, so then I have 203 left. There you go, by the way. All right, so I'm Nathaniel Leanhart. I'm from Schaumburg High School. And before I start, I'd like to thank some people too. Well, Schneid covered a lot of the bases already, but I'd still like to go over them. I'd like to thank my high school, and I'd also like to thank the IHSA organization for allowing this to happen, because I really love this setting, as in we can just come here and discuss these ideas that help us grow and help us become more knowledgeable people about the things that we know. And it's better going through life knowing about the world around us instead of being closed in a bubble, where I feel that when we have this debate, it provides an opportunity for us just to be aware. And I'd also like to thank my team, every single member, because I know for a fact that without them I would not be standing here today. Every single one of them has provided skills and basic necessities that I need, whether it's just helped me with my speaking skills, my argumentation styles, or the structures of my case. And I really appreciate it, especially the coaches too. All right. So just as a basic roadmap, I'm going to be going NC-AC. Phone ready?
Yep.
Judges? All right, here we go. I negate the resolution because placing political conditions on humanitarian aid is just. Because the resolution is an evaluation of justice, I therefore value justice. Justice is the idea that people ought to get what they deserve. As an observation, the resolution evaluates the humanitarian aid, provisions of assistance to victims of natural or man-made disasters in foreign countries, thus implying a native or domestic government giving the aid. In the original state of nature, there was unchecked free will, and people infringed on the rights of others. John Locke theorized that people came together in order to form government, giving up some freedoms in order to receive protection. Governments have an obligation to ensure the safety of their people before moving on to other matters. Since the resolution evaluates the ability of governments to be just, and the only way for governments to be just is by fulfilling the obligations posed by the social contract, my Bali Criterion is fulfilling governmental obligations. My first contention is that political conditions help the donor country, the one giving the aid, achieve security for their nations. Political conditions involve a bargaining relationship in which donors offer finance as an inducement to recipients to adopt particular policies. Political conditions protect the donor country from terrorism and other threats. The UN reports in a 6-month period study during 2009 that more than 40 humanitarian aid workers and distributors were killed and kidnapped in Sudan. According to Julian, an Israeli journalist, a militant group known as Hamas held aid distributors at gunpoint, taking 3,000 blankets and 406 parcels of food. But that was not the first time they had stolen aid. Zanotti from the Congressional Research Service reassures that the U.S. aid has political conditions to stop the Hamas militant group from getting these supplies. According to Hastings in 2013, Al-Qaeda has taken more than 500,000 euros worth of humanitarian aid from Britain, leaving the 13 million people starving and dying from malaria and cholera to pay the consequences. Valentin describes militant groups in Syria that steal humanitarian aid and spread violence in neighboring countries, such as those of Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Worst of all, they use this stolen humanitarian aid as a means to recruit new members in promise of these supplies. Political conditionality on humanitarian aid is therefore justified because it fulfills the governmental obligation to protect for its citizens or aid workers from militant threats. My second contention is that political conditions help the recipient government, the one receiving the aid, fulfill their obligations. Political conditions help these countries in two main ways. First, political conditions help the recipient government increase security. Vivian Collingwood, an Oxford graduate, writes on the obligation to provide conditionality to areas of conflict. She says that if conditionality is not used, then the aid's fungibility is converted into other forms of power. There is nothing to stop it from being duplicated, wasted, used to fund the private interest, or even worse, used to fund the active repression of a country's citizens. She also stresses the effects of unconditional aid in regions such as those of South America, when lack of conditions worsen the country's situation. Sengupta writes about China's recent unconditional aid policy to Zimbabwe and Sudan just to get a few natural resources. Much of the aid was converted to human rights abuses that China attempted to cover up. China continues to fund these human rights abusers today because there's no political conditions to stop them. By placing political conditions, as Collingwood suggests, recipient governments would be upholding the social contract and fulfilling its obligation to protect because more people would get the aid and less of it would be used to commit human rights abuses. Second, conditionality decreases dependence. Larson and Skidmore write in their book, Tanzania, Sudan, ZAR, Mozambique, Niger, Togo, Zambia, and Haiti have been and remain heavily dependent on external aid, but show disappointing economic results. Because when the donor government provides for the country's citizens, they lose the incentive to adopt particular policies to help them. Collingwood returns to explain, conditionality offers the opportunity to encourage states to change their behavior in return for aid. Conditionality is seen as a particularly useful tool because it entails using economic pressure without resource to military force. Political conditions therefore help the recipient government better provide for its people, thus upholding the social contract and fulfilling its obligations to provide for its citizens. Now, moving on to the affirmative side. First of all, we're going to be looking towards my definition specifically because it brings in the positive and negative conditionality. Whereas he only talks about taking the aid away, it's not just that, it's also providing positive incentives, such as we're going to give you humanitarian aid. If you accept this policy, we'll give you more humanitarian, developmental aid, and other positive benefits. He doesn't account for this, so we have to look at my definition. Now, moving on to his Bali Criterion. First of all is that autonomy isn't the only aspect towards justice. Justice is the idea that people ought to get what they deserve. People deserve more than autonomy, but moreover is that some people don't deserve autonomy. This is going to be the second attack, especially when he talks about criminals, and then where we have the obligation to take away some autonomy because of the social contract and because criminals abuse their autonomy. We have to not only be respecting the autonomy of the citizens, but we also have to be looking towards the governments. But the third attack is that when he's saying that people aren't human when they don't have autonomy, that means that he's dehumanizing people who don't have autonomy, such as those as handicaps. They don't have autonomy, children don't have autonomy, because they're not rational. That means that he's dehumanizing not only the people with mental disabilities who have those handicaps, but he's also dehumanizing children. Now, moving on to the first contention. First of all is that this is not resolutional because it's talking about an example of recipient conditionality. Because of the resolution is talking about placing political conditions on humanitarian aid to foreign countries, that means that it's the donor country's conditionality, but the conditionality from the recipients was that they didn't want GMOs. This is an example of recipient conditionality. But two is that it also said that the study was unconclusive. So that means that he has no impact because there are no harms coming off of this. The people's autonomy weren't harmed by that. No one was harmed physically or mentally whatsoever. But also is that it shows in Zambia that they held out, is that this actually goes against what he said, because that shows that they do have autonomy. Now, moving on, is that in response to this, when he talks about giving food aid, according to Nunn, it actually increases the amount of violence in the area, because food aid by 1,000 metric tons increases the incidence of civil conflict by 2.5 percentage points, because what's happening is they're giving this humanitarian aid to countries that are already unstable, and they're trusting them to do a good job. That's not what's going to happen, because they can't properly supply it without the political conditions. But even more, we're still going to outweigh, because this is just one isolated example of political conditionality being applied to food. He doesn't have substantial evidence to prove it in every other single condition. So we're going to outweigh. But then, moving on to, he says that we're dehumanizing people because we're using them as a means to an end. That's not true, because we're using the political conditionality and the humanitarian aid. Now, going on to his second contention, I'm going to turn this. Because when these people broke the social contract, they couldn't provide for its people, so it necessitated having these political conditionalities. Now, according to MIT in 2014, first of all, is that they talk about this the positive political conditionality, and that it can lift 80 million people out of poverty. With the political conditionality, he talks about Brunian autonomy. That's not an impact, because we're going to be taking 80 million people out of poverty. But also is that according to The Economist in 2013, recipients want political conditionality because they know that they can get reform from an experienced government. So that just proves the positive benefits of political conditionality.
Cool. You ready? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Let's start by talking about the definition you give at the top of the NC. When you say that this implies domestic aid, what does that mean?
Okay, I'm talking about domestic political conditionality. So when we have political conditionality, it can be split into a few subcategories: positive, negative, and then donor and recipient.
What's domestic conditionality?
That's the donor. Wait, okay, here, just let me explain this. So when we have the recipient government making political conditionality, as in your case of Africa, their political condition was, we will accept aid if it's not GMO. So that means that they have a recipient conditionality that's coming from off of the humanitarian aid, but the resolution is placing political conditions on humanitarian aid to foreign countries. So because that's a domestic political condition, it's non-resolutional, because it wasn't a political condition for the donor country to only give that aid.
Okay, cool. Let's talk about your framework, which is the social contract. How old does someone have to be in the United States to sign the social contract?
No, the social contract,
okay, so
we're bringing up contractualism.
Okay,
No. We're bringing up contractualism. This is where the idea is that there are abstract contracts in our daily lives that we don't necessarily think about.
So when do people consent to the social contract? Or any of these contractual agreements that you're talking about?
No, that's the point, is that there's abstract contracts that we don't think about. When we abide underneath the government and we look at the laws and we participate not only in the government, but in the society, we are active participants, not only in the way that we live, but also in the government and in the areas that we participate too.
Okay, so what if I don't want to be part of this, this implied contract? What happens?
Then you can move.
Really? Where to?
Anywhere in the world.
Doesn't that contract exist in other countries, though?
Well, there's no government in Antarctica.
Oh, so I'll just live with the penguins.
No, you can. That'd be fun. But no, so what I'm talking about is that you can choose what government you want to be under. There's not a necessity to say that you have an obligation to stay in one government, but there's positive benefits that come off of the government, so we have an obligation back to the government in order to achieve this social contract, because we pay taxes in order to receive things such as health care.
Cool, that's good. Let's talk about your first contention, where you talk about bad things happening to aid workers. Where do you have solvency in this contention?
That's when I bring up the Zenoti evidence from the Congressional Research Service, where it talks about how the U.S. placed political conditionality on the humanitarian aid to stop it from getting to the Hamas militant group.
Can I see the Zenoti evidence?
Yeah, here. I'll bring it out.
Okay.
And it also talked about peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, and moving towards two-state agreement.
What do you mean by peace negotiations?
Peace negotiations, it's just talking about how, they wanted to prevent terrorism in Israel from the Hamas and other militant
Is this what you read in case?
No, I paraphrased it and I just quoted it too. This is what it is.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
That's great. I think that's pretty much time. So I'll sit down. If I can keep that to a
Oh, yeah, sure.
I'll go back to my start my speech. Okay. Cool. So, if everyone's ready, I'm just going to take some running prep starting now. So I have about a minute and 16 left. Order is just going to be my case, his case, starting on the framework. Is everyone ready? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay, cool. Since my opponent and I share the value of justice, you should be looking to the value criterion in this round to solve the framework debate. My opponent makes a few responses to my value criterion. The first one he makes is that justice doesn't include only autonomy. Well, this is obviously true. The way the framework works in this round is to interpret what the most important thing is. Obviously, there are lots of different important things, but my argument is that autonomy should come before any other concerns. The second response he makes is that some people don't deserve autonomy. But that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that everyone from the get-go has an obligation to respect someone else's autonomy. If there's a murderer who disrespects someone else's autonomy by killing them, that's a really bad thing. The murderer shouldn't have done that. But that doesn't change the fact that every person has a fundamental right to respect the autonomy of others. The third argument he makes is that it dehumanizes people, and he makes an argument about people who don't have a lot of autonomy. But that's not my argument. My argument is that taking someone's autonomy from them is denying their humanity. If someone has a debilitating condition, that doesn't mean they're not a person. That doesn't mean they don't have some degree of autonomy. My argument is that limiting the autonomy that someone has in every instance is dehumanizing them. Now, you should be preferring my value criterion because remember, Freed explains that autonomy is the foremost thing that people are due because it defines what it means to be human. A person is a person because of their autonomous capabilities, which means that they are due the right to make those choices and live their life as they choose above anything else. Next, I'd like to go on to my first contention, which talks about coercion. The first response my opponent makes this is he says the Africa example I gave is talking about recipient conditionality, but there are a couple problems with this. First, it's clearly not. The Zerby 1 evidence specifies that the GMOs were included specifically so that Western governments could benefit by allowing their corporations to have access to African markets. But second, it doesn't matter who's setting the conditions because it's still coercive. Now, the next response he makes is that the study is inconclusive, but first, he doesn't explain what this means, and second, whatever the results of the Zambian panel were, that doesn't change the fact that they were being extorted by Western governments and that the refusal of the aid was a crime against humanity because people starved. The next response he makes is that aid increases violence in an area and that there's civil conflict. But the problem with this is that there are other ways to give aid unconditionally that don't just involve throwing money at warring parties, like having a minister on 3Os. So what you should be looking to in this round is the contention that establishes that aid is coercive because what it does is it uses the citizens of a country as leverage. This denies their humanity and their autonomy for two reasons. First, because they don't have the right, because they can't control their government anymore. If the donor government is being coerced by another country, then the citizens of that country don't have a say in what the policies and laws enacted by this country do. But the second impact is that they're being dehumanized because they're being used as leverage. The donor country is threatening the lives of the citizens in order to enforce the conditions, and it's asserting that its goals mean more than the lives of these people. My second contention argues that donor capture is a really bad thing. His only right, he makes this turn and says that donor capture is okay because these countries couldn't provide because of the social contract. But my argument is that it's still not okay because donor capture entails taking over parts of these countries and allowing the donor country to impose its own policies on this country, which denies the autonomy of the citizens. He also reads these two pieces of evidence that don't really relate to anything. The first one is this MIT study that has absolutely no warrant. He just asserts that it would help a bunch of people without telling you why that's true. And the second thing he reads is this autonomous evidence that says that people wanted conditional aid. But I've read that evidence. It's only talking about a survey of 600 people, and they don't represent the millions of people that live in countries that need it. Next, I'd like to move on to his case. Starting his value criterion, first, don't prefer the social contract because no one actually consensus. This is just an implicit agreement that you're forced into. There's no country on earth that doesn't have some enforced social contract, which means you can't opt out. But second, autonomy is a prerequisite because you can't consent to anything if you don't have autonomy. If you deny the autonomy, then clearly the social contract isn't legitimate. Next, I'd like to move on to his first contention, where he talks about how political conditions are beneficial. The problem with this is that in the long term, they don't work because, in the long term, political conditions don't work because they actually make things worse for warring parties. Beat Schweizer writes, while a peace agreement usually establishes or reestablishes a form of national government, this is often not reflected in the situation on the ground. Political leaders in worlds who took advantage of the political war economy are still in place. What this means is that what happens when aid is given is that nothing actually changes, and the people who are causing the problems in the first place are still around. His second contention argues that the recipient government is benefited, but you can turn this because remember the recipient government is being controlled by foreign governments, which means there's no benefit.
All right, I'll just take the rest of my prep time starting now. Judges? Roadmap, I'm going to be going down the negative side of the flow and then the affirmative. Here we go. All right, so starting on the Bali Criterion debate, first of all, he says that no one accepts this. That's not true. People accept this all the time. They accept this through following the laws. When we cross the street every day and we don't jaywalk, that means that we're accepting the laws of the government and the obligations that are bestowed by the social contract. But also is that he says autonomy is a prerequisite in order to have the social contract. But that's not my Bali Criterion. It's fulfilling governmental obligations posed by the social contract. My Bali Criterion is not the social contract. It's just the government fulfilling their side. So not only is that just not an attack against my Bali Criterion, but it doesn't prove my Bali Criterion unjust. We're supposed to be evaluating the governments and their ways of acting just, which brings me back up to my observation. My observation goes unattacked and it extends across the flow. The impact is that we're going to be looking specifically towards governments because those are the actors that we are evaluating in being just. That is going to extend my Bali Criterion because when he's talking about the respecting autonomy of the citizens, that's not going to be the actor in the situation, so that makes his Bali Criterion non-resolutional. Now, moving on to the contention one. First of all, he says that it doesn't help in the long term. Well, first of all, neither does humanitarian aid, so that's a non-unique argument. Humanitarian aid is supposed to be for emergency reasons. But moreover, is that that's just not true when I bring up the MIT card with about 8 million people being brought up out of poverty. But then he reads this card and he talks about how bad people are still in place. He doesn't respond to my argument at all. I said that it increases the amount of security for the donor country. And then I bring up how 40 humanitarian aid distributors were killed and kidnapped in Sudan. Where were their political conditions to stop them from getting killed? They weren't there. That's why we have to vote on the negative side, to save those 40 people. But moreover, he doesn't attack when Al-Qaeda takes 500,000 euros worth of humanitarian aid, and he doesn't talk about how terrorist groups in Syria steal the humanitarian aid and use it to fund terrorism. He says that it won't help in the long run, but not only is that not true because we're taking out the amount of terrorism, but this is also a global impact. Because not only is this just a recipient government's impact, but it's also a global impact because that's international terrorism. Now moving on to the contention two. He tries to turn this because it means that we're controlling governments. But that's not a turn because specifically what I'm talking about is he ignores all of the positive benefits. When I talk about how it increases the amount of security, he completely ignores my Sengupta evidence when I talk about how China used unconditional aid and it increased the amount of human rights abuses. Why? Because it went to corrupt governments. So when he brings up how these corrupt governments were still in place, that doesn't matter because humanitarian aid without political conditionality is still going to do that, but it actually stops the abuses from happening because it provides reform for the government. This leads me on to my second point about Larson and Skidmore and the Collingwood 2. He completely drops this and ignores this. When he tries to make this turn, it's non-warranted because I said that political conditionality decreases the amount of dependence. He ignores my Larson and Skidmore evidence about how 8 countries are dependent on humanitarian aid because there's no conditions to help reform the government. That extends across the flow, and that's basically going to drop all of his offense because his argument is that political conditionality takes away the autonomy of governments. But that's clearly not true. Now, moving on to the affirmative side of the flow, I'd like to talk about the Bali Criterion. Not only have I taken this out with my observation because we're looking at the governments providing for the citizens, but also is that he says is that autonomy actually comes before and it's the most important. But that's not true as I talk about how there are other aspects of justice. Even if it's the most important, he's still not talking about all of the just benefits that come off of fulfilling the governmental obligations. But moreover is that you can't have autonomy without life. And that's what the governments are obligated to provide. They're provided to give safety to their citizens. But also is then when he talks about we should respect autonomy from the get-go. Yeah, that's true, but that's what the governments are doing. That's what the governments are doing. They're respecting their autonomy and actually helping the governments be more efficient. And then moving down to the third attack, he just doesn't really respond to this. He just says, that's not an argument, that's not what I was saying. But he doesn't respond to the warrant. I'm saying that because he's saying that people are dehumanized without autonomy, that means that he's dehumanizing children, mentally handicapped people, and other people like that don't have the proper amount of autonomy. That extends across the flow, and it's going to drop his Bali Criterion for that reason. Now, moving on to the contention one. I provide a lot of examples. He covers them, but I would like to extend my fourth attack that talks about how it's a part-whole logical fallacy, where he only shows that this is only true in some areas, where he's talking about Africa, and then giving only food aid. I already showed you how it actually increases the amount of how it increases the amount of violence in areas, but then he says that there's other ways. First of all, that's non-resolutional because we're talking about political conditionality, not other ways. But just because there's other options to a solution, that doesn't mean that my example is inherently unjust. So those examples are going to extend across the flow when we talk about none increasing the amount of violence and the part-whole-logical fallacy, because we're going to be outweighing. Because LD is about negating or affirming the resolution in the most amount of situations, and he only provides this one situation. Now, moving on to the other argument where he talks about how I'm dehumanizing people, I responded to this about how we're saying we're not using the human as a means, but the humanitarian aid. He doesn't respond to that, therefore he concedes it extends across the flow. Now, moving on to the second contention. I turned this and I stated that they broke the social contract, so it actually guarantees the places. But now he doesn't respond to the MIT evidence whatsoever. This is going to be another voter issue. Specifically, he says that there's no warrant, but it already doubled agricultural years and decreased child mortality rate by 30% in Kenya. There is just one example of how the MIT study increases and benefits those people. Now, summing up the voter issues of this debate, the voter issue number one is going to be how it's going to be helping the donor government by helping those 40 people with the humanitarian aid, but also is that it's going to be decreasing the amount of terrorism. Voter issue number two is going to be about the security and dependence of these countries. It takes out his entire case and the turn that I made on his contention too.
Do you have a minute 16 or a minute 26?
16.
Okay, cool. I'll take it starting. So order is going to be framework debate starting on the affirmative case, then just giving voting issues starting on the affirmative side of the flow, moving to the negative. Is everyone ready? You should prefer my value criterion of autonomy for this round because autonomy is the first and foremost thing that everyone is doing. It's the most important aspect of justice because autonomy is what defines our humanity and it is what people are do above all else. Framework debate in the LD is not about choosing every aspect of justice. It's choosing which one is the most important one so that we can evaluate impacts around. Insofar as I'm proving that autonomy is the most important thing that people are doing, you should be looking at. But there are several other reasons. First, because as you remember, Fried explains that people are dehumanized when they die in autonomy. My opponent keeps trying to make this response that I'm saying that people who are handicapped or young aren't autonomous, but that's not my argument. My argument is that people are due the autonomy that they have. And if you restrict someone's autonomy, then you are dehumanizing them because you are saying they don't have the right to make choices. So this is completely not responsive. Then finally, you can extend the response that I made to his framework that you need autonomy in order to be able to consent to the social contract in the first place. He's right when he says that his standard isn't the social contract, but the social contract needs to exist, and it still needs to be important in order for his framework to function in the first place. If people can't consent to the social contract, then it doesn't exist, and the obligations the government has doesn't matter. So because you're looking to autonomy before anything else in this, also just really quickly to mention, he's also tried to assert that autonomy doesn't apply to government action. My standard is really clear that everyone is required to respect autonomy. That includes donor government. So now that we know that autonomy is the most important thing in this round, I'd like to move on to the first voting issue, which is that conditional aid is coercive. This is something that happens 100% of the time in every instance of conditional aid, because as Zerbe 2 specifies, the alternative to the denying humanitarian aid with political conditions is a crime against humanity. It is murdering the people of these countries, which is a terrible thing. But so you can flow through the impact coming out of my first contention, which is that when countries deny aid that is imposed on them by Western donors, they are killed and people are used as leverage. He wants to talk about 40 people. I want to talk about 10 million people in Zambia who are used by Western governments as leverage in order to force them to allow GMO crops in. Zambia refused, and people died. When you use people as leverage like this, you are dehumanizing them, you are disrespecting their autonomy, and you are destroying their ability to influence the actions of the government. But the second voting issue in this round is the issue of donor capture, which comes from conditional aid. His responses to this don't make any sense, because my argument about these social contracts makes sense, because my argument is that in any instance where the donor exploits the dependency, they're controlling the government, and they're not helping the government make better policies. What they're doing is substituting then their own goals, their own aspirations, and their own policies in place of that for the donor government. This has a really clear impact for the standard, because the impact of this is that the citizens of the recipient country don't have any influence over their own government. They don't have any influence over the direction the government takes, which means that they don't have any say, and their autonomy is being denied. But the third reason to vote, the third reason to negate, is the Schweizer evidence that I read against the NC, which says that political conditions don't actually change anything in violent situations. Humanitarian actors still have to cooperate with warlords to make conditions happen, which means that in the long term, the warlords causing the conflict in the first place were still there. This outweighs his evidence because it shows that placing political conditions is actually allowing warlords to continue and allowing them to continue to perpetrate war, which is the biggest impact to his framework, because obviously war has a slew of terrible things. So in summary, there are three reasons to negate. First, because conditional aid is coercive. Second, because it controls donor governments. And third, because it elongates war. Thank you.